So risk management, okay, what it's all about? Well, actually, negotiation is has a lot to do with risk management, because what is a negotiation? Well, it's to manage risk, to develop a relationship with the counterpart as a way to manage risk. And managing risk, therefore, you need to know what are these risks. Therefore, within a certain context of an operation, you have to be able to identify in a systematic way the type of risk you're facing, assess the severity of these risks, and evaluate the likelihood. And on that basis, you have the element of information, hopefully the data, on which you can develop an objective, systematic approach to risk management. So risk is everywhere, you know, and we're here to see what are the key risks we want to identify. And we see risk is not simply, you know, intangible. Risk is an expected impact. Something may happen that is both in terms of likelihood, what's the probability for this risk to happen, and what's the expected severity, the expected impact of that risk. But by itself, it's not yet the risk we want to deal with, because this is too improbable or too uncontrollable. We want to see risk on which we can have an impact in terms of reduction measures. What are the reduction measures we can take to limit that risk? And that gives us what we call the residual risk. Okay, so risk management is about risk, and then trying to find what can we do to prevent or mitigate that risk, and that leaves us the residual risk. A negotiator works in this blue part. A negotiator involves risk reduction measures. The negotiator comes in, establish relationships, build trust as a means to reduce risk. So when we look at risk, we look at two angles constantly. We said likelihood, that's the probability, the possibility that the risk holder, that is the organization, the individual, the risk holder will suffer from that risk. Likelihood it refers to this possibility, while the expected severity refers to the impact of the risk if it's realized on the risk holder. Okay, and the two are quite different. You know, take for example, you're driving a motorbike somewhere in the Middle East. You know, the likelihood you have an accident, okay, is given. And if you drive by night or you drive by day, if you drive during a snowstorm, or if you drive on dry land, your likelihood of risk will evidently change. However, the impact is going to be the same. If you fall this, you're going to hurt yourself seriously and so on. Well, if you put a helmet, well, this is where you're dealing with the severity. You're trying to mitigate the severity by having an helmet. Okay, so likelihood is about the probability the accident will happen depending on the circumstances, while severity is how you protect yourself against that risk to diminish the vulnerability. So to look into likelihood rating, as we go into a matrix, we want to know how we will build the matrix around clear categories to position risk. So we look first into likelihood rating. Likelihood rating go from what is almost certain, that this risk will happen. And we say it's due to happen. It always happens, except in circumstances that would be so exceptional that it's not going to happen. So it's almost certain is going to happen. Likely is 1 degree, you know, less sure it's going to happen. It's in similar circumstances, it happens. Okay, there are statistics that confirms this. Possible, it says yes, there has been cases, but it doesn't happen all the time. Unlikely, now we're crossing over. It's the possibility it happened is lower. It's usually not the patterns. It's not the usual chain of events. And finally, there's rare. It rarely happens. It's exceptional. It has not been seen in the past. It's not this type of things we see. So you see, likelihood is from the most likely to the least likely. And we will categorize risk based on their likelihood, okay? Severity rating is different. Severity rating, as we said with the helmet, you know, there are risks that are catastrophic. That's what you have on the right-hand side. Catastrophic means it's irreversible. The damage caused is permanent disability, it's lethal, it's total destruction of assets, massive loss. Basically, it's terminal. When you have this risk happening, it is a severe situation that is very hard to come back from. While critical, it's hard to recover, but it's possible to recover. So severe injuries, interruption of activity, you may have destruction of asset, but it's going to be a slow recovery. So between a critical risk and a catastrophic risk, the difference is catastrophic risk, it's very hard to come back. It's almost impossible. While critical, it is possible, you need to work very hard. Moderate is, you see, it's reversible, it has a significant impact, it will push at the suspension of activities for a short time, you need to work on it, but you will come back. Marginal means it will be a minor disruption if it happens. It will be delaying your activities. It will, you would have hoped to be able to plan it, but it's not always possible. It's not a major impact. It's more like an hindrance. And negligible, the damage is negligible. It's a routine issue, okay? It's to be expected. And that's why we have contingency planning. So I would like to illustrate these levels of impact with an example. Let's assume you're managing a truck company, transport company by truck, okay? An example of a negligible risk is to have a flat tire. It happens that your truck will have flat tires, and this is why you have spare wheels on the truck, okay? It's to be expected. It's a negligible risk, there's routine issues, and you address it promptly. Now, a marginal risk, it's that there is, for example, heavy traffic. It doesn't happen all the time. You wish it's not there, but it does happen, to which you wish you would have planned, but you cannot plan it. But it's not dramatic, but it will have an impact on your operation. Now, what is a reversible risk is, for example, a petrol station on strike. Well, that will push for a suspension of activities. You need petrol, but it's something it has a significant impact on your operation, but it's something you can address. You can work with strikers, owners, trying to find your way out of this. And this is where negotiators are the most active, is on moderate risk. Now, when we move to critical risk, for example, you have a truck accident. Well, this is a major incident. This is a major damage. To destruction of asset. The recovery is going to be slow. You may have injuries. It's hard to recover, okay? But ultimately, if your whole business goes up in flame, there was a fire into the garage, all your trucks burned down, well, this is a catastrophic situation, okay? And this is almost irreversible for your company to come back from that risk. Okay, so you see the gradation. Okay, you have a gradation that pertains to, what is the most catastrophic to the most negligible. And the strategies to address them are also between what we see as reducing the impact, mitigation measures. Okay, mitigation measures would diminish the vulnerabilities. If you would be a truck company, well, you put a spare wheel. Or you buy an insurance against loss to fire. You have first aid equipment in your trucks. You have a relationship with the union of petrol gas station owners. You can take measures to mitigate the damage if the risk happens. Okay, this is what we talk about risk mitigation. Okay. It looks at the risk, it says, when it happens, when it's realized, here is what I'll put into place to make sure that the damage is contained. While reducing likelihood is different. And this is where negotiators come in. Reducing likelihood is when you take preventive measure for the risk not to happen. You look at the risk and you say, well, what can I do for this not to happen? happen. You know, mitigation measures is if it happens, how you limit the damage. Preventive measures is how to prevent it to happen in the first place. That's where negotiators work. Negotiators are working, and you have that picture here of an MSF colleague engaging with you know, members of an armed group. That's to prevent the risk. If you wanted to mitigate an attack, but this is where you're going to put sandbag around your office, you say. To contain the damage of an attack from an armed group, you will put sandbag around your office. But if you want to prevent the attack to take place, you will establish a dialogue with the armed group in the first place. The link with humanitarian negotiation and risk management is there. Humanitarian negotiation is a risk prevention measure. And humanitarian operation can operate because they have negotiators who work on preventing risk. It doesn't mean the organization should not take mitigation measures. Yes, they should have sandbags as required. Yes, they should have first aid in the car. They should have radio when it's needed. They should have a number of security and safety measures to ensure the safety and security of organization. But negotiator comes in addition. They come there to prevent the risk. So that's where we are. We negotiators play an important role in risk management, especially in conflict zone. And humanitarian negotiators must know how to draw this map, the matrix of risk, to be able to identify what are the risks in the context and what should I be doing as a negotiator to help prevent these risks along other measures to mitigate risk. For example, you may have a catastrophic risk that is likely to happen in places like, you know, frontline Yemen or Somalia. You could say killing of staff is a significant, likely catastrophic risk because killing of staff will simply prompt the withdrawal of the organization. It's catastrophic. Well, it's catastrophic in personal terms, it's tragic. But in organizational terms, it would be, you know, we have no appetite for killing of staff. We will be leaving the country. So therefore, it is catastrophic for the organization. But you may be in a context which is likely to take place, okay? And your assessment says there's kidnapping too. Kidnapping is critical because it's reversible. You can negotiate a kidnapping crisis. And in that case, it's possible it may happen. You could have extortion issues where an armed group or part of a government will impose enormous pressure to extort financial assets from the organization. It's unlikely to happen. It's less dramatic because it can be addressed. You can have cases of corruption on the checkpoint, at the village level. They want to have a benefit associated to your aid program, or more at a negligible way, but almost certain, you'll have pressure in hiring local staff. You know? So you see, you have there 5 risks. They have a different severity, and they have a different likelihood. Okay, and for each of these risks, you have a role as a negotiator. Of course, there are measures to diminish the severity. Killing of staff, we could say there's curfew. You impose a curfew, you put walls around your office, you create compounds that are in fact bunkering staff. These are mitigation measures against that risk. But as a negotiator, your role is to establish trust, to establish communication and relationship with the parties to the conflict that will diminish the likelihood of that risk, okay? The same with kidnapping. You can take a lot of measure to mitigate the risk of kidnapping, including hiring specialists on kidnapping negotiation, or even having, you know, making sure that people are accompanied, escort, and so on. But as a negotiator, your role is to diminish the likelihood of kidnapping by having, again, relationship with potential source of risk. Extortion, the same idea. Corruption, for example, having an explanation, even it's a marginal risk, and in some contexts it's really common. You need to establish a dialogue to say corruption is a problem for both of us. If we cannot demonstrate the integrity of our processes as an organization, maybe we won't have the funding. And it goes with pressure hiring, the same, okay? So you see, the role of negotiators in the risk management is to work vertically to diminish the likelihood of risk, okay? And against that, you put the humanitarian imperative. And that defines the area where you're comfortable to work, okay? Because evidently, you have a situation where the risk is extreme, that your governance, your hierarchy will not accept that you function within these risks unless they have been negotiated down, you know? And they create what we call the risk threshold. This is the limit that your governance or your management will tell you you have to function below that risk threshold. We call that also the risk appetite. The risk appetite of your organization is to say you can function within certain parameter of risk. And the role of negotiators is to work your way down on hiring practices, on issues related to corruption, extortion, kidnapping, and for the most important risk. But you see, this investment will take much more time, resources, competences, more severe the risk is. If you have a major risk of killing of staff in a context, you will need solid negotiation capabilities to bring that risk below the threshold. Okay, to say we are able to operate because we have guarantees, security guarantees in a war zone that our staff will not be attacked. If it's about financial means, we have negotiated the integrity of our supply chain, of our administration, and even of use of local resources. So you see how important the role of the negotiator. Not only you have security and safety measure horizontally, but the likelihood of these risks to happen is where most of the safety and security is actually built, okay? To make this a bit more complicated, we have to do that each time we have a source of risk. You know, we have operational risk, as we discussed now, operational risk to security of operating in places like Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan, but you have also other sources of risk linked to COVID-19, you know, or reputational risk. Humanitarian organizations have a very high threshold of reputational risk. They receive funding, they receive the trust of the donors to work in most of the most complex environment where you have enormous pressure put on them. So reputational risk is one of the key aspects of a negotiation strategy, meaning that you may make a compromise in operational risk that has an impact on COVID-19 risk. You know, for example, you know, you would say, well, to manage operational risk, I need to establish a close relationship with communities. You know, of course, you need to build trust by having dialogue with the tribal leaders, to go visit the villages, to go into the district, to moving a lot. But in the COVID-19 pandemic, you're becoming a super spreader. If you move around, shaking hands, having tea, what happened if you have COVID-19? You yourself just made you having a huge impact in terms of risk associated to COVID-19, which if it's discovered, then you have a reputational risk associated to your operation because you've been a super spreader around the country where there is very little resources to deal with COVID-19, okay? So you see how these levels are connected. And for the negotiator, they need to have this in mind, and not only in their head, but also on paper against their wall, where they say, these are the, as we did, these are the key risks. This is my role as a preventive measure, but how do I connect what I will do as these preventive measures with the other level of risk?